Assalamualaikum. My name is Nawa Alia, and right now I will talk about the Look East policy during the administration of Tun Dr. Mahathir 1.0. So the fast-growing economies has resulted the emergence of the 5 Asian tigers that was started with Japan. Malaysia was one of the industrializing nation that wanted to initiate the success of this nation, especially Japan. On 8 February 1982, Tun Dr. Mahathir announced Look East policy. He stated in his speech, when we ask Malaysians to look east, it is not so much about living standard that we are talking about. What we are interested is in your ethics. It is not just skills we are after, but more importantly, the correct attitude to work, including the sense of belonging, which breeds loyalty. This shows that Tun Dr. Mahathir admired the Japanese work ethic, morale, because he believed that this is the main reason why they can succeed. By introducing this policy, he felt that Malaysians can embed the Japanese and Koreans' attitude to contribute to Malaysia's economic and social development. The objective is to increase the quality of management among the workers, as well as creating a community with good value and positive ethics, with the aim of accelerating Malaysians' development. Right now, I will talk about the application of Look East policy in Malaysia. So the Look East policy, the LEP has been applied through several programs that involve various organizations to achieve the goal of this policy. These programs are divided into 4 categories, which are training program, education program, cultural program, exchange program, and executive development program. The first one is training program. Initially, it was known as implant training, a technological and industrial training program. It is designed for engineers and technicians who work in the public sector. The duration of this program usually being held between 3 to 6 months with intense Japanese course. Japanese companies is sponsored by the Japan-Malaysia Economic Association. Secondly, in Executive Development Program, it is designed for managers who work in public sector. Usually, this program will take place around 1 to 3 months that involve both public and private organizations to organize this program. This program offers the chance for the management in Malaysia to evaluate their performance and problem. Before the introduction of this policy, Malaysia emulated the Western model of management at every level of management, from universities to business until the government administration. Thus, this program under the LEP revised Malaysia's management from Western point of view to East countries such as Japan and Korea point of view. Thirdly, through cultural exchange program, the main organization that involved in promoting Japanese culture in Malaysia is the Japan Foundation. They succeed in organizing several programs at the Japan Culture Center in Kuala Lumpur. For example, the National Theatre of Malaysia organized the Dumb Type performance tour, a contemporary arts workshop that was conducted by Oriza Hirata, and Japanese language seminar. The Exchange of Person program, this program involved academicians between the two countries to carry research projects. These programs reflects that Japan and Malaysia are committed in strengthening the bond by learning the culture that they possess. Lastly, through education program, under LEP, students in Malaysia was given the opportunities to further their study in Japanese university. According to the data that was provided by the Embassy of Japan in Malaysia, we managed to send a total number of 7,896 students from 1982 until 2007 to study in Japan under the Look East policy. Malaysia managed to send these students due to the support in terms of scholarship from Japan and Malaysia. For example, under Yayasan Pelajaran MARA, the Malaysian Higher Education System Program. So right now, I will talk about the result of the implementation of Look East policy in Malaysia. The implementation of Look East policy has resulted many positive and also negative outcomes to Malaysia. This policy has been debated by many researchers that did their research on this policy. One of the positive outcomes of this policy is the rise of Japanese companies in Malaysia. Nearly all states in Malaysia, including the remote states such as Kelantan and Terengganu, has Japanese companies and factories. Based on the data provided by the Embassy of Japan in Malaysia in 2006 and 2007, Japan is the main investor in Malaysia besides United States and Singapore. Besides, most of the Malaysia's electronic goods came from Japan. It's the top importer based on the statistical data from the Department of Statistics Malaysia. This two-way in economic exchange has benefited both sides. So another positive outcome is Japan are willing to help Malaysia by introducing the Japan's rescue package to Malaysia. This package consists of a total of $1 billion of loan assistance, $0 billion of export-import banks loan, and $0 billion of trade and investment insurance. This policy represents Malaysia's seriousness in maintaining bilateral ties with Japan. Japanese investors are willing to invest in Malaysia because the advantages that we possess in terms of cheap labor, stable political environments. They are fascinated by Malaysia's hospitality. So, despite the achievement of this policy, there were still many criticism of this policy received. One of it is the failure of Malaysians in embedding Japanese work ethics. This is because they found it too rigid and it is too difficult to enforce in Malaysia. Besides, in automotive manufacturing in Malaysia has failed in implementing Japanese style of training because he found that Malaysia companies are not consistent in providing training and Malaysian workers are more keen in self-learning rather than structured learning like Japanese companies. This reflects that the rigidity of the Japanese work style and ethics are not suitable for Malaysia workforce. Right now, I will talk about our group analysis of the Look East policy under Tun Dr. Mahathir administration. So, under Tun Dr. Mahathir administration, Look East policy was a turning point for Malaysia's administration, especially for civil servants and public services. After looking at the history of him, he was born during the Japan-occupied Malaya. He used to go to Japanese language school during that time. We can conclude that during his time in that school, he experienced Japanese style of learning, study, and working ethics that this molded him to become more disciplined in his life. Besides, we can see the way he viewed Malay society in his book, The Malay Dilemma. By introducing this policy, he was determined that if Malay embedded the Japanese work ethics, they can improve their life. Thus, we can conclude that his experience during the Japan occupation in Malaya and his surrounding in Japanese language school inspired him to introduce this policy.
Hi, Assalamualaikum. My name is Muhammad Syed Islam bin Sabri, matrix number 275330. So, the history of IMF financial crisis started from 1997 until 1999. It affected the Malaysia and Southeast Asia countries. So the financial crisis started in early 1997. The financial crisis also been called as the Asian contagion. So the Malaysia stock market index began a downward spiral together with stock market of several Asian countries in the financial crisis. On 14 July 1997, Bank Negara of Malaysia gave up the defense of the Malaysian ringgit after jacking up the short rates of 50% and spending about 10 billion US dollar on unsuccessful monetary operation. 2 years on, much has happened and the Asian crisis appears to be history. However, the Asian crisis has had a much greater and more adverse impact on Malaysia, and the world market crashed in 1987. But before the financial crisis occurred, Malaysian economy has largely been on a sound footing since independence. It had enjoyed high growth, full employment, and low inflation rates about a decade before it was taken over by the financial crisis in 1997 until 1999, with the increasing liberation of the domestic financial markets in the developing economies and the opening up of this market to the outside investor and significant of fast growing component of foreign private capital flows. takes the form of portfolio investment between 1990 and 1998. Direct foreign investment flow to these countries become the 5 times larger, but portfolio investment flows during the period jumps into 15 times of the initial value. For example, in the case of Southeast Asia and Pacific, the latter when come up uh, 148 million US dollar in 1990 to 2,701 US to 2,701 million US dollar in 1998. For Malaysia, they went up from US dollar 947 million US dollar to to 278 million over the period. The impact of uh, the impact of crisis to Malaysia's economy and Southeast Asia. So in Malaysia, the financial meltdown started towards to the close of July 1997. The first major fall in the stock prices occurring in the first week of the following month. The stock market fell by 68.58% and the dollar ringgit rates plunged above by over 37% during the worst patch of about 63 weeks between July 1, 1997 and until September 8, 1998. On July 29, 1997, the fifth Tuesday of the crisis period, the KLCI was about 1,031.61 and the US dollar RM rate was about 0.3946. And as you can see in the graph, so the selected Asian exchange rates against US, the in 1998 until 1999, the graph before that, 1995 until 1996, the rates was at the index at the hundreds, but in 1997 until 1999, the graph downwards to below 20, and as you can see, the Malaysia GDP also downwards into the negative 8 in 1998 until in 1997 until 1999. So the net portfolio investment shrunk 22 billion from positive RM 10.3 billion in 1996 to negative RMs 12.9 billion in 1997. This led to a collapse of the stock markets that brooding the foreign debts, massive corporate default and non-performing loan, resulting in banking crisis. So Malaysia's reaction towards IMF financial crisis as the political action to handle this crisis. During this financial crisis, the Malaysian Prime Minister was Tun Dr. Mahathir, and Malaysia did not seek funds from International Monetary Fund (IMF) because of its relatively low level of foreign indebtedness. On the macroeconomic policy front, it raised interest rate with the view to stemming capital outflow. The currency was floated to allow free capital flows, and public expenditure was reduced by 18%. On the financial sector, Malaysia changed the definition for non-performing loans from 6 months arrears to 3 months arrears following the international standards. But unfortunately, with the implementation of this policy, what started as a financial and currency crisis soon became a full-blown economic crisis. Aggregates domestic demands declined in 1998 for the first time since 1986, owing to a significant negative contraction in private investment by 55%, a private consumption by 10%. The real economy contracted 40%, with GDP growth dragging from positive 7.7% in 1997 to negative 6.7% in 1998. The stock market plummeted by over 70%, and the ringgit fell to its lower of RM 4 ringgit 0.9 to $1 in January of 1998. But ironically, although the Malaysia strategy rejected the IMF aids package, but the first policy approach was in fact IMF inspired in terms of the fiscal policy. The adjustment called for an 18% reduction in government expenditure. The several infrastructure was postponed, such as the Bangkok Dam, the express rail link, and the land bridge to Thailand. Also, the Dr. Mahathir also in the early 1998, he also knew clearly that the pro-cycle of IMF macroeconomics policies were not working. So, Dr. Mahathir set up the National Economic Action Council and centralized decision-making policy. In July 1998, he making a new policy called National Economic Recovery Plan. The policy that he made seen as an alternative to orthodox IMF policy. The objective of this were to stabilize the local currency, restore market confidence, maintain financial market stability, restructure corporate debts, recapitalize and restructure the banking sector and revitalize the economy. So, Dr. Mahathir also changed the foreign exchange policy by highly open economy with external trade, export and import constituting over 200% of its GDP. So for this, at the height crisis this happened on the height crisis of the crisis in 1998 until 1997 and 1998. Speculation dropped to be offshore ringgits. So in September, he banned the offshore market trading of the ringgit and gave exporters of grace period to repatriate their offshore ringgit deposit back to Malaysia. At the same time, he managed to fix ringgit exchange rates to the exchange rates from $1 is 3 ringgit 80 cents. And Dr. Mahathir further introduced selective capital measure that was strongly opposed by the IMF at the same time. He implemented a 1-year moratorium from the purchase dates of share was imposed on the repatriation of proceeds from the sale of this share for foreign institution and person. The aim was to discourage speculative short-term trading in local share. As example, Malaysian residents were allowed to make payment to non-resident or make investment of up to the equivalent of uh, 10,000 ringgit Malaysia, above which they had to obtain prior approval from bank negara, and residents were not allowed to obtain ringgit credit facilities from non-residents. So the conclusion for the IMF financial crisis in 1997, the financial crisis in 1997 has hit Malaysia and Southeast Asia. During the Asian financial crisis, Malaysia faced a large depreciation on the ringgit and massive capital flights. Even though it raised domestic interest rates, International Monetary Fund (IMF) offered funds for countries during that time. Countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and South Korea accepted funds from the IMF. Malaysia has rejected funds from the IMF because its relatively low level of the foreign indebtedness.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Ibn Nafis bin Abu Zara with the matrix number 275661, presenting about National Defence Policy. Okay, so National Defence Policy are proposed as Dynamo Plan in 1962. It is to broaden the function of Malaysian armed forces, but it is failed in 1963 because British refused to refuse because it is required so much cost due to the inclusion of Sabah and Sarawak to the Federation of Malaysia, which means the budget to British allocate between the Peninsula of Malaysia, Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore at the time so higher for the British to do the costing for the defense things, and Malaysia increased the commitment in terms of defense and security following the increase into the region. During 1965, Malaysia and Indonesia having a confrontation and Singapore withdrawal make the security and defense aspects gain attention for how important the security and defense aspect is. In 1966, the National Defence Policy failed to produce white paper, the defence white paper, which is in Malaysia, in bahasa Malaysia is Kertas Putih Pertahanan. Nevertheless, the government of Malaysia decided to set up the National Security Council (NSC), also known as Majlis Keselamatan Negara. In 1981, the white defence paper was formed but failed to present it in the 1986. However, the Majlis Keselamatan Negara approved the proposal paper as the reference for Majlis Keselamatan Negara. The objective of national defense policy is to approach is to protect and defend the country's interests and the core of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and economic well-being. Okay, so there are changes in national defense policy implementation, which is I divided it to three phases, which is the era of Tunku Abdul Rahman from the year of 1957 to 1970, and the era of Tun Abdul Razak and Tun Hussein On, which is from the year of 1971 till 1980, and the era of Tun Dr. Mahathir Mohamad from the year of 1981 to 2003. Okay, so the foreign policy of any countries are also affected by the prime ministers or their top leaders of a country, ideologies, the environment development, and also the perspective. Okay, so let's move on to the era of Tunku Abdul Rahman, which is the first national defense policy phase from the year of 1957 to 1970. During this era, Tunku Abdul Rahman implemented the concept of dependency because during that time, Malaysia are so dependent towards the British and Malaysia also a pro-West country, because due to the factors of Malaysia as a new country, because they get the independence during the year of 1957 from the Queen Elizabeth of Britain. And the foreign relation limited to the non-communist countries such as Indonesia, Philippines, India, Thailand, and also the Commonwealth country. And we move on to the second phase, which is the era of Tun Abdul Razak and Tun Hussein On from the year of 1971 till 1980. The concept implemented in this era is neutrality. They changed from the dependency concept to the neutrality concept because both of Tun Abdul Razak and Tun Hussein On take a very careful steps when it comes to build a bilateral or multilateral relationship due to the communist threat during that time. And also during this second phase, Malaysia joined the Organization of Islamic Country and also the NAM organization, and also the neutrality concept implemented during this era of Tun Razak and Tun Hussein On is one of the initiatives to follow the international requirement as a tool to keep pace with the trends of the rest of the world. And also during the Tun Hussein On era, Malaysia signed the Five Power Defence Agreement between Malaysia, Singapore, Britain, Australia, and also the New Zealand, and joined the ZOPFAN and also the SEANWSAC organization. And let's move on to the era of Dr. Mahathir, which is during this era, they implemented the self-reliance concept and become to a country that flow east towards to Japan and also Korea. The focus is to make Malaysia as a role model to the third world country. And during this era also, the Angkatan Tentera Malaysia modernized their tools and their defense concept. And also Malaysia are least focused on the FDPA, the Five Power Defense Agreement. Malaysia did not left the agreement, but they least focus on FDPA and make a full focus on Asian at that time. And also Malaysia during Tun Dr. Mahathir era also joined exercise with the United States, United Kingdom, Russia, Korea, and China, and focus on exchange of defense, military delegation, personnel information, and military training, despite of the built bilateral relationship with the country. Okay, everything's agreements that signed for foreign policy or diplomacy in this current world will have an impact towards that agreement that any country signed for. So the impact of national defense policy is they create a defense diplomacy via bilateral and multilateral with most of the country in the world, and also to strengthening the Asian relationship by the defense cooperation. Okay, so move on to the conclusion. The national defense policy are focused on to defend its strategic interests and also to maintain the national security of our country itself, and the changes from dependency concept to neutrality and also to self-reliant concept shows that Malaysia are really committed with their defense policy to protect the national interests and our country's sovereignty. So that's all from me. Thank you.